Hi everyone, it's Ren here. Good to see you guys. Welcome to my room. I'm back from Malaga. Some of you, I think it's a little bit over 1,000, watched the video that I made with my ENTP friend, Julian. So that's pretty cool. And it's pretty cool that you guys checked that video out because it's always very I'm always very grateful to my friends for accepting to make a video. Often it's a suggestion that I make to them, like kind of out of the blue, just how to get this inspiration, this idea. Julian is an extrovert, he's an N-type. I knew that there were higher chances that he would accept doing the video because I have lots of friends who refuse. But I knew that he would accept. He required a tiny bit of convincing, not a lot. He was kind of like, okay, yeah, no, okay, I'll go for it, so, I just had to tell him he was amazing, but this is not the topic of this video. I was recently having a conversation, or I was involved in a thread discussion on a forum, the INFJs forum, infjs.com, which is really a community with the majority of INFJs, but you have a lot of people, especially at the moment, it's a very diverse kind of periods. I've only been a member for about 2 years, but there's lots of, NTs, there's lots of, there's INFPs, ENFPs, there's quite a variety of types. And there was a thread created recently that had to do with asking other people, other members, what is the least feeler type? In other words, what feeler type is the least a feeler in a way. Now, since that would be, that's inspiration. I'm taking inspiration from this thread to turn it into my own product. But we could also turn it around in a rather uncreative way and just simply ask, what is the most feely type? Or what are the different shades of feeliness? Because what's interesting about this question is that once you ask it, you realize, and this is something that was pointed out in the thread, that it's not an easy answer to provide. It's not an easy answer to provide because there's just many dimensions to feeliness. When I read the question, I was immediately tempted to answer that the least feely type, if we talk about least for now, was INFJ, followed by ISFJ. And the reason why I said that was because, in my opinion, both INFJ and ISFJ have the potentiality, have the possibility of having a well-developed TI tertiary. And SITI and NITI, I think, when wielded together, have quite a good potential to be very logical. And this is demonstrated by the fact that, especially among INFJs, you have INFJs doing not too bad in fields that require a fair bit of logical thinking, such as philosophy, for example, and science. You'll see that they're more common than almost any other kind of feeler. But at the same time, then I realized, and that's also something I said in the thread, I realized identifying and making an argument, somewhat brief argument, I must admit, for INFJ, say, being the most logical feeler, is not synonymous with the INFJ being the least feely feeler. It's completely possible to imagine that these two categories are not mutually exclusive, and actually I think that they're not. I think that's, having thought about the matter further, I think that on a lot of conceptions of feeliness, INFJs are not the least. They're not the most, I would argue, but they're not the least. So the question becomes, how do we try to figure out, along this kind of interpretation of or spectrum of most to least or least to most, how do we try to refine this understanding of this concept of feeliness? A friend of mine suggested a rough methods, let's call it a method and a scheme, which is, admittedly was very kind of roughly formalistic, but I think was very useful for what it showed. What he proposed to do was to broadly divide feelingness into two categories. I believe he calls the two categories of feelingness breadth, and depth. So, and what he meant by that was not, this particular kind of feeler is like deeper, as in more interesting or whatever, than this other kind of feeler. What he meant was that in terms of relating to the feeling function, breadth would be the number of situations in life across the whole. Imagine that you're dealing you take the 100% situations you deal across a week. How many of those situations do you engage and negotiate with an emphasis on feeling? So that's breadth, okay? It's like the ratio of reliance on feeling for dealing with particular situations. And the second, depth, is when this feeling, is manifested and engaged, how deep does it go? How profoundly does that engagement reach into the feeling side? So one is more of a horizontal function, so that's the breadth, and the other one is a vertical function. It's the depth. And he proposed to ascribe certain numbers, indicative numbers, from 1 to 4, I believe, to the various feeler types. And now this could be controversial, so I'm warning you guys. This was a hypothesis, or just trying to illustrate something. A point which I think is interesting is this distinction between the breadth and the width of feeling engagement for feelers in this case. And he took, I think, to give you a very simple example, he said that an ESFP, for example, would have very large breadth of feeling. So I think he scored it at 4, actually. So almost everything is engaged via feeling. But it's also the type for which he proposed that the contrast with depth was the starkest, was the most extreme. And he proposed to assign the value of 1 to the depth of engagement. And again, it's not so much about not being a deep person. It's more like being able to bounce back from that particular feeling engagement and moving on to another one, and not remaining stuck where you are, because you're like really, getting really deep into it. If you take, for example, an ISFJ, perhaps you could say that ISFJs, because they're SI dominance and they can have developed TI, even though they're often quite nice people, if you worked with ISFJs, you'll notice that they can be quite dedicated and rational, and sometimes they're not that easy to distinguish from ISTJs at first. I mean, of course, when you engage with them more, you do see the difference, but it is not true that ISFJs are always like the nice guys that, it's... So let's say that maybe they have a breadth of, let's say, of 2 or 3, and then a depth of 3. And so you'll see that if you could use the square and say, or you can do multiplications. You can multiply. You could say, well, for example, for ESFP they would score 4, and 4 times 1. If we say 2 and 3 for ISFJs, you'd score 6. And so in a way, you'd see that the ISFJ then scores higher than the ESFP. And you could apply that to the different types. And I think that what appeared quite quickly was that the most feely type, according to this particular scheme, would have to be INFP, because INFPs would score very highly on the breadth side and very highly on the depth side, on average. Again, of course, we're generalizing, but on average, probably 4 times 4, 16. and that would be higher than INFJs. You know, they're INFJs. Maybe I think on the breadth side, they would be almost as developed as INFPs, but maybe they're not quite. Maybe ENFJs would be. ENFJs would be shallower in depth than INFPs and INFJs would be slightly shallower in depth than INFPs. So you see that the answer would have to be who's the most feely INFPs, and perhaps the least feely would be ESFJ or ESFP. Because you could think that first of all, a type that is extroverted is less likely to dwell on the feelingness of the feelings and move on. Extroverted. S, more down to earth. And I would say that, well, that's already ESF. Yeah, so there's only ESFP or ESFJ. Personally, that would be my answer in general. But upon thinking about it further, now I didn't plan to make a long video, but I guess I'm going to need to take a few minutes. Thinking about the matter a bit more in depth, I realized that perhaps there's even a way to go further into the refining and making it more granular of this concept of feeling and feeliness. Of course, there's always a risk that if you do that, you lose in systematicity, because what you do ends up looking like a description, a very detailed description. Is it possible to still draw, law-like elements from it? But nevertheless, I was thinking, considering my own case, because in this case it's only my case, but you guys, for the most part, are INFJs, so I'm really interested to hear what you think, if you feel the same way that I do, but other types can also participate, of course. Now, what I mean to say is, at first I was like, yeah, sure, it's true. INFJ, I probably don't feel things like with the same level of depth as defined by the scheme as an INFP friends of mine would. But I realized upon thinking the matter further that the reason why I thought that was because I did not spend as much time analyzing and dwelling upon and parsing those emotions and feelings as INFPs do. At least my INFP friends really seem to do, and I should say my INFP brother. My brother is I know so well that I can really tell you that that's something that is extremely central to his life. But the thing is, that presupposes that depth is, in a way, the result of being able to prove that you have thought about the feelings and that you have been able to understand them or to analyze them or to, in some way parse them. My difficulty is with understanding my feelings sometimes and explaining my feelings. I find it hard. I don't think I would find it as hard perhaps as an INTP might say. And you guys might tell me, like, I know that Roisin, who is a follower, is very good at understanding her feelings and at describing her feelings. But I wonder if other INFJs might not be a bit more like me. The thing is, could it not mean that I feel the things just as deeply and I dwell upon them just as deeply? It just so happens that it's my curse as an INFJ and an INFJ type 5 that the words just, and it's not just the words, it's in myself. Like, I do feel deeply, but once I start trying to understand them, it's almost like I'm using TI to understand them. And when I FE use TI in combination, it just looks like something that's quite very rational already, almost no longer in the domain of feeling. But is that a sign that I felt less deeply, or is it just a sign that I felt with the same depth, but I cannot really make sense of it to myself as easily? Or could it be that it is indeed a sign that it is less deep, but could it then be designated as more intense? And could we develop a third conception, a third category, which would be intensity of feeling? Because I think that in terms of my intensity of feelings, they're very intense. And not necessarily when I'm stressed in general. But anyway, guys, let me know what you think, and I will see you very soon. Ciao!